Surbiton is a quiet, highly affluent commuter town just outside London. It is known for its tree-lined streets, its wealthy residents, and its perfectly preserved Victorian architecture. Local histories offer a tidy, respectable origin story for all this brick and stucco. They say the town was conjured up in the 1830s by Thomas Pooley, a wealthy gentleman from Cornwall who carefully laid out these grand avenues before being unjustly forced out of business by his rivals. But the public records from the time reveal a different person. By 1835, the real Thomas Pooley was a twice-bankrupt former baker from Kent. Rather than sitting on a fortune, the 44-year-old was living out of a coffee house on Newgate Street in London, trying to hustle work as a brewer's agent. This presents a mechanical problem. How does an aging serial bankrupt with no capital manage to acquire 33 acres of premium farmland and build a luxury metropolitan estate out of thin air? Surbiton stands today as a monument to a precarious financial gamble that ultimately erased the man who made it. In the spring of 1838, the London and Southampton Railway opened a new line. The tracks bypassed the ancient established commercial centre of Kingston-upon-Thames and instead carved a deep, smoking trench straight through the quiet, adjacent farmland of Surbiton Hill. Where the local elite saw noise and smoke, Pooley saw a 20-minute commute to London. He scraped together every scrap of credit he could find, leveraging malthouse leases, trading ships, and the debts of insolvent brewers, and bought 33 acres of that Surbiton farmland. He intended to build a fashionable retreat for wealthy city merchants, complete with views of the royal parks. To build without cash, Pooley used the Victorian speculative model. He leased divided plots to independent tradesmen, who bought materials on credit. But if a builder defaulted, construction stopped, and the half-finished house and its unserviceable debt reverted directly back up the chain to Pooley. To keep buyers interested, Pooley needed a proper gateway. The railway company had originally built little more than a track-level cottage to serve the area. Pooley wrote to the directors and convinced them that summer crowds heading to Hampton Court Palace would flood their trains if they built a commodious, premium station at the top of the Surbiton cutting. By 1839, he had his station. The illusion worked. By the 1841 census, Thomas Pooley and his son Alexander were living in the sweeping curve of Claremont Crescent. The former baker recorded his occupation as a gentleman of independent means, though he was sitting on top of a volatile mountain of borrowed money. The newspaper advertisements of 1841 promised pure air and panoramic elevations. The physical reality on the ground was a chaotic industrial site. The newly laid avenues were unpaved, and the constant traffic of heavy carts hauling brick and timber churned the streets into impassable mud. For the new town to survive, it needed its own independent commercial life. Pooley tried to establish a local market, but he was immediately blocked by the Kingston Corporation. Kingston held an ancient royal market charter, and its established elite effectively starved Surbiton of commercial independence, refusing to recognize it as a legitimate parish. Then the credit chain snapped. A sudden tightening in the London financial markets meant Pooley's undercapitalized bricklayers could no longer get the short-term loans they needed for supplies. Tools were dropped in the mud, scaffolding was abandoned, and exactly as the contract dictated, the debts of dozens of half-finished villas shifted squarely onto Pooley's shoulders.
At the very top of this debt pile sat Coutts and Drummond's, deeply conservative London banks that managed concentrated institutional wealth for the aristocracy. Seeing the gulf between Surbiton's marketing copy and its muddy reality, the partners moved to limit their exposure. They called in Pooley's loans. Walled out by the local Kingston elite and crushed by the banks, Pooley's illusion of the Kentish gentleman evaporated. Facing the slow, absolute ruin of the Victorian debtors' courts, he fled across the English Channel to France. In January 1843, the partners at Coutts and Drummond's took possession of a distressed asset, 33 acres of rutted mud and stalled construction. To the Victorian middle class, respectability was a financial requirement. A development associated with defaulted mortgages and absconding debtors was a toxic investment. If the banks were to secure high-paying tenants, the stigma of Pooley's insolvency had to be scrubbed from the soil. The banks executed a rebrand that began with the geography of the town. Looking at this 1840 map of Surbiton, you can see Thomas had named the town's principal commercial artery Alexander Road, after his son. The banks wiped the name away. It was replaced with Victoria Road, trading the reputation of a failed speculator for the absolute respectability of the crown. The banks then deployed the one weapon Pooley never actually had: large amounts of stable capital. They paved and drained the muddy tracks. They handed the building carcasses over to solvent firms who completed the stucco facades to an exacting standard. Thomas Pooley never recovered. After returning to England, he survived a fraud trial at the Old Bailey, only to have his final remaining assets liquidated by the Court of Chancery. At the age of 65, alone in an isolated house in Hampstead, he finally took his own life. It is a brutal historical irony. The very aristocratic banking institutions that drove Pooley to his death and actively scrubbed his name from his own streets were the only ones capable of actually building his visionary gamble. Thomas's son, Alexander, learned nothing from the collapse. He spent the next 3 decades pursuing a series of highly litigious speculations. His commercial schemes even included running the Alhambra Music Hall in Leicester Square, a venture of outlandish scale for a man perpetually facing insolvency. The financial gravity caught him eventually. Alexander fled to Paris, but international extradition laws had tightened. He was arrested and dragged back to London to face charges of fraudulent bankruptcy and ultimately locked inside the stone walls of Holloway Prison for contempt of court. But the third generation of the family broke the cycle. Alexander's son, Thomas Alexander Pooley, was born in Surbiton in 1841, right at the peak of his grandfather's illusion. Growing up in the wreckage of that collapse, he chose a different path. He trained as an analytical chemist. In 1881, he was appointed as a statutory public analyst for Essex. His literal, legal duty was to test food and drink and verify that things were exactly what their sellers claimed them to be. After 2 generations of cutting corners and faking wealth, the family finally produced a man who achieved respectability through honest, verified work. Today, there are no statues of Thomas Pooley among the grand Victorian villas of Surbiton. His only modern monument sits at the top of a hill, away from the wealthy crescents he designed. It is a drab, unremarkable block of modern flats called Thomas Pooley Court, a quiet reminder that history is written by the solvent, leaving the true architect to be entirely forgotten by the people walking his streets.